Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining us for today's webinar. This is one of a series of sessions organized by the Center on Global Energy Policy as part of the 7th Annual Columbia Global Energy Summit. So I'm Geoff Heel. I'm a professor at Columbia Business School, and I'm the moderator. We're going to be talking about law and policy for energy and climate solutions. It's a very topical issue, very central to the Biden administration's policies. Let me just remind you that this event is being webcast live and a full video will be available online in a couple of days. Now, for those of you joining us via Zoom, let me remind you also that you can pose a question to the panelists at any time by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. If you look at the bottom of the screen on the right-hand end of it, there's a Q&A button. If you click on that, a panel opens up. You can type a question in that and hit return, and it becomes visible to me and to some of the support staff. So you can enter questions for the panelists at any time using that facility. We've got a set of panelists who are uniquely well qualified to enlighten us on issues to do with law and policy and energy and climate. We've got Francis Beinecke, who's the former president of the Natural Resources Defense Council, generally known as NRDC, just one of the most influential environmental groups here in the US. Has had a great deal of impact on environmental policy, historically speaking. And we're also joined by Cheryl Lafleur. Cheryl is a distinguished visiting fellow at the Center on Global Energy Policy, and she was previously chair of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, abbreviated to FERC, a rather inelegant but very important set of initials there. And FERC is the premier energy regulatory body here in the United States. Finally, we've got Mary Nichols. Mary is also a distinguished visiting fellow at the Center on Global Energy Policy, and she was previously chair of the California Air Resources Board, generally abbreviated to CARB. California, under Mary's leadership, really set the course for much of the US with respect to air quality policies and climate policy. So all three of these ladies have been extraordinarily influential in the area that we're concerned with here, and it's a real privilege to have them here, and it's a privilege for me to moderate this session. I've asked each of them to speak for 5 to 10 minutes to give us their own personal perspective on these issues. I'll then moderate a discussion and pose a few questions myself. And then I'll start picking up questions from the audience. And let me remind you, audience, that you can use the Q&A button, the bottom right-hand side of your screen. Just type in questions there and hit return, and they appear on my screen. So without further ado, Francis, would you like to kick us off?
Yes, I will. Thanks, Geoff. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's particularly a pleasure to be here with Cheryl and Mary, who are two absolute giants in this field and certainly know more about the combination of energy and climate policy than I do, but we're going to have an engaged conversation. So as we start this, I just want to say that to me, having this conversation today is very much framed by the IEA report on the roadmap to net zero that came out this week. I think it showed us once again the urgency that we're under to act on climate. I think the IEA has never been on the absolute forefront of the transformation to a clean energy future. So having this report come out, I think, is absolutely critical and very, very impactful for the conversation we're having today. So just turning now to the challenge we have here in the United States on climate energy policy, we're in an all of the above, every single opportunity that's open to us, we need to act on. We clearly need a legislative campaign around getting the American Jobs Plan adopted. President Biden has come out of the gate so quickly on making climate one of his top priorities to act on it, embedding it in the American Jobs Plan. We need the stimulus and the innovation and the investment that calls for to transform the power sector and unleash the transportation sector's conversion to electric vehicles and to clean energy. So, that is essential. We need a clean energy standard embedded in it, and we need to do it all very, very quickly before the midterms. And I think this really contrasts where we are now compared to where we were in the Obama administration, where we didn't actually get going. We got going on cars, but not on power plants until the second term. But the Biden administration is out of the gate quickly. The environmental community is unleashing, I'd say, its full range of advocacy tools to try to get the support necessary to get this legislation enacted. But that's not enough. And clearly we need a parallel effort on the regulatory side. And, this is where Mary and Cheryl's expertise comes in, how we use current government authorities to the maximum extent possible. We've done that in the past. But I think what's different this time is we're actually connecting climate very, very potently to economic considerations and also to public health considerations. So there's an integration across many sectors coming together: labor, investment, public health, environmental justice, and climate justice. And it's that intersection of ensuring we're promoting policies that address the immediacy that people are feeling in their own communities around public health threats, and the immediacy that we're feeling all across the nation with climate impacts that are happening right now. So, I think that there's no single policy, as people say, there's no single bullet that's going to get us to really address these issues. It's an all-out effort across all of the authorities that we currently have, and new authorities and investments that we need through the American Jobs Plan. It's urgent, it's broad-based, and it's critical that we undertake this now. And I think, as I say, I think the thing that's different now is how these issues are connected. So how communities that have worked independently in the past are now working together. And hopefully we can achieve these goals so we can meet the United States goal of a 50% reduction by 2030 and get on a path to net zero by 2050. It's a very big undertaking. It's going to take tremendous energy, effort, and commitment to get there. And now Mary and Cheryl, I hope, are going to tell us how we're going to accomplish that. Thank you.
Thanks, Frances. That's a nice call to action there. Very, very, very forceful indeed. Thank you. Cheryl, you want to add to that and give your perspective?
Sure. Thank you. And I'm also thrilled to be here with Frances and my colleague at Columbia, Mary. I think that we really are, it's such a cliche, but we're just at such a critical inflection point on climate in the United States. And I do most of my work in the US energy sector. And I think we have some real advantages on our side. We've had tremendous technological innovation with wind and solar and other power coming down so much in cost and so available to us. We have excellent natural and financial resources in the United States. And I do think we have an increased sense of public urgency compared to when I went to Washington at more or less the beginning of the Obama administration. But we also have some big challenges, and two of them I would point out. One is a lack of a national consensus sufficient to lead to forceful legislation with a national carbon goal or a national siting policy that I'll talk about. And the second is, because we don't have a clear national consensus that we can get mandatory climate legislation, we're operating in a very disaggregated regulatory structure as people decide about this. I wanted to use as an example one thing from my part of the world, which is the need for electric transmission. Start with the proposition, you need to decarbonize the electric grid first, because that's about a quarter of our greenhouse gas emissions in the United States, and decarbonizing the way we make electricity also will support decarbonization of transportation, heating, some industrial applications, which are a big part of the rest of our greenhouse gas applications. And in order to decarbonize, we're going to have to expand and strengthen the high voltage electric grid. These are not the lines that go down your street, the big wires that connect resources to people. Today's grid was built over many decades, mostly in the middle part of the 20th century, a lot of it, to support the power system of yesterday, which was mostly big central station resources delivering to population centers. Now, and in the future, most of what we're building is renewable energy, wind, solar, geothermal, expanding our hydro, pump storage. And those generators are very different than the legacy fossil generators. They're different in geography, first of all. When you put up a coal plant, you just need a site with some water that you can get your fuel. You put it as close as you can to where the load is. But if you're going to put a major wind plant, it's much better to source it where the wind, well, not only better, essential, where there's wind to power it, because that's your fuel. And 2/3 of the land-based wind potential in the United States is in 15 states in the central part of the United States. The other great resource is right off the Atlantic coast, where we're looking at President Biden talking about going from currently about 30 megawatts of wind off the coast of Rhode Island, a tiny bit off Virginia, to 30,000 megawatts in the next several years. The second big difference is that these renewable units are different operationally. Unlike a motor that you turn on and off, you'd need a little more, you ramp it up. Their operation depends on the wind and the sun. So they need to be run in a more complicated dynamic grid with other resources that balance them out. Right now, a lot of natural gas generation. In the future, it may be hydrogen or long duration storage that we're working on. And that's even true of distributed resources. We see in California where there's so much solar energy, they can completely use up their daytime peak with rooftop solar in many cases. But when the sun goes down, they need to borrow from their neighbors, and sometimes they need to send their solar somewhere else where somebody needs it. So we're going to need a bigger grid to connect the new sources, share resources to keep the system going, to support electrification of cars and trucks and heating, and to make the system more resilient to security and other threats. The National Renewable Energy Lab estimates we need to build about 50% as much transmission as we have now, about 150,000 more miles by 2035. You can read other estimates suggesting we need to double or triple the size of the grid by 2050. But it's hard to build linear infrastructure in the United States. It can take 8 to 10 years to put up one big transmission line, and there's a litany of canceled lines to deliver either wind or hydro to population centers over the last decade. The biggest fights are where the line's going to go and who's going to pay for it. And the plan, and this is all divided up between FERC, my old agency, does the planning process and who pays. The federal land and water agencies do the federal siting, and the states and localities do most of the siting over private land. And because there's trade-offs and nothing is ever perfect, but we found a big disconnect between people's political support for acting on climate change and their willingness to accept facilities near them. When you see a line going down your street, you say, oh, there's a line, it must be serving my house. How wonderful, they're working on it. But when you see a line going overhead, you say, oh, that's going beyond to someplace else. It's probably going to a substation coming right back to your house, or meeting a goal that your governor who you elected set, but that might not be visible because of its distance from you. So the ideal solution would be federal legislation to give us more federal siting authority. I'd even to have the federal government help build a backbone grid. I've drawn the analogy for years, and I was thrilled to hear President Biden use it, President Lincoln with the railroads and President Eisenhower with the highways. And the system we have now is if President Eisenhower said, you know, we could really use an interstate highway system. So you states work together and find good places, find win-win solutions. Make this, I wanted to go coast to coast. Could you work on this and just kind of everyone compromise and we'll find a good place? And that's the way we're trying to put up transmission now. FERC can help. It's been 10 years since FERC looked at the planning rules. They're working now on potential changes that make it easier to count environmental benefits toward the cost of a line, that require looking farther out in time, that try to advantage interregional transmission and some other things. They're trying to work with the states. The federal land and water agencies are now in their whole of government approach under Biden. They have a lot they can do at the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, the Bureau of Land Management, and others to help federal waters and federal land be a good place for transmission. But at the end of the day, it's going to require trade-offs at the state level and at the regional transmission organization level to kind of make some decisions and put some of this up, because we have the power, we have the technologies. These are good jobs, but we have to build the lines to connect those technologies to people to get where we need to go on anything like the time frame that Francis and all the experts are talking about. That's my pitch, and I'll turn it over to.
Thank you very much indeed. Fascinating. So Mary, over to you.
Great. I'm happy to pick up where Cheryl left off and to add a couple of slightly different thoughts, but I really want to endorse the comments of both of the prior speakers. I am an optimist about what can be done. I am not optimistic, however, that Congress can act to make it happen. Now, it's true that President Biden both delighted and I think to some extent surprised me, at least, by how quickly he came out of the box with a set of serious proposals for what to do. But to the extent that those proposals are dependent on action by Congress, I think we're going to be disappointed, and we already are seeing the resistance cropping up. So while I agree that the federal government can't just say, you states go out there and make it happen, even though I come from a background of a state that has been making things happen for a decade and more now, I still think that it's going to take action by the administration. Now, fortunately, the federal government has tools that it can use that it hasn't been fully using up until now. And in particular, I want to call out a section of the Federal Clean Air Act, which is sometimes neglected or even dismissed as being a potential tool for achieving our climate goals, but I think has been underutilized for perhaps fear of political backlash, perhaps concern about litigation challenges. I tend to be to assume that there will be litigation challenges and that they should be minimized as much as possible, but that without taking some risk, we don't ever get anything done. So my pitch, I guess, is if we're making pitches here, is that EPA, with the direction from the White House and at the request of the Secretary of State or the President or both, should be unsheathing its sword, which is Section 115 of the Federal Clean Air Act, which provides that EPA can work to get the states, can basically require the states to develop plans to reduce emissions, both from the transportation sector and from the electricity stationary source sectors, based on a finding that we're contributing to a pollution problem in other countries, which of course we are, and that other countries are taking action to reduce that problem themselves. So this is the so-called international section of the Clean Air Act. It has never been given the attention that I think it deserves, although a number of noted legal experts and law professors have been writing on this topic for several years now. But I want to really put it forward here because I believe that invoking Section 115 and seriously taking advantage of the latitude that it gives EPA to craft solutions is something that needs to be on the table, and we need to see it moving, if only to inspire Congress to take action to do something themselves. I mean, if they don't like it, they can do better, and they probably could do better, or at least do something, more targeted and quick. But as we all know, targeted and quick are not attributes that we can really look to right now, coming from leadership on the Hill. So I'd like to urge that the administration not only stick with their current plan, but that they up the ante. And I think in addition to the Section 115 approach, the other agencies, as Cheryl alluded to earlier, can begin to dust off some of the tools that they have been reluctant to use in the past, and push harder, frankly, than they have been allowed or felt that they were allowed to do, to get action, for example, on the grid. I think FERC may not have direct authority to go out there and build transmission lines, but there's a lot they can do with the regulatory authority they have if they choose to do it. So I'll stop with that and leave time for more discussion and questions.
Thank you very much indeed. Let me actually ask Cheryl and Francis what your reactions are to this idea that the agencies have tools which they haven't really been using to the full, and which they could perhaps push further. I'm particularly interested in this section 115 of the Clean Air Act, but anything else of that sort? I mean, isn't it not a bit of a problem there, for example, that if it doesn't require legislation, then it could be reversed by a subsequent Congress?
Well, I think it's true and not true at the same time. I think there are definitely tools that agencies have not been using. For example, the Department of Energy under Section 1222 can help get transmission built by sort of decreeing something a joint private public project where there's a national need and helping to get it built that way. That's a gross oversimplification of that section of the law. Secretary Moniz tried to do that once and ran into a logjam with Senator Lamar Alexander, if I recall correctly, was the one who was opposed, and they were going to change the law and so forth, and the whole thing fell apart. But that is still on the books and can be, as an example of something that can be dusted off. It has some hoops you have to jump through to make it work, but we just can't leave any strategies on the table. The reason I said I only partly disagreed, because I believe there are other cases where agencies have stretched their authority because they don't newer laws. They're using laws that maybe were put in place for a different purpose, and then they always risk whether they're going to be tipped by a court because agencies are working so hard to adapt the laws they have to what they're trying to do, all of which would be solved by legislation that you could send Francis and Mary off and they'd have it written by 5 o'clock, but we don't see that imminent.
Right, so just to add on that, I think that because of the urgency, the time urgency that we're under, this is the critical decade. We can't, wait for Congress to act. We have to look at all the tools. Section 115, I know we examined at NRDC very carefully when I was there. I'm sure it's still being carefully examined. And I think you have to be bold and take action. And, we've all been in the courts one way or the other, and you have to risk that and believe that your case is strong enough that you're going to prevail, even though you anticipate that you'll end up in court. So I think that, we should go forward with the tools that we have. Clearly, the Clean Air Act has a lot of tools that can be used. We've used them before. We need to use them again. 115 hasn't been used, but let's examine, and I know there are lots of law professors who've looked at it, who can examine carefully what might be the appropriate way to use it and see if that is possible. I think, we all believe that if we could get legislation that wrapped all these things up, that would be preferable. We're certainly making that effort, but we don't know that we're going to get there. So we have to look at other authorities as well. Absolutely.
Thanks. Great. Cheryl, I'd like to pick up a point that you made about the importance of extending the grid in the context of renewable energy. Obviously, as you said, makes way more sense to have your solar panels where the sun shines and your wind farms where the wind blows. And that here in New York, that's typically for both of those a long way away, except of course for the offshore wind. So I mean, but it has proved incredibly difficult to extend the high voltage grid. Almost politically impossible. What can we do about that? I mean, I'd like your comments on that as an insider, and then on Mary and Francis's comments too on that.
I think some of the things I mentioned of one thing FERC can do is to try to keep looking at improving the planning rules to make it easier for these regional transmission organizations to agree on transmission by counting all of the benefits. And actually, the rule that FERC put out 10 years ago, Order 1000, which was supposed to be the seminal transmission rule and has not worked as well as we'd hoped, has worked in New York, and they are finally building some transmission to get the wind and hydro from Western New York and the nuclear that's upstate down to the metropolitan area. So there is some going on, but I think agreeing on the siting is a big part, and we need to do a better job, all of us so-called experts, communicating the tie between some of these things, having a wind farm that you might have to look at when you're at your summer home. I mean, that was the big issue with Cape Wind, the view shed, or having a line that goes through partly through a forest because you couldn't entirely do it through existing rights of way. The trade-off between that and the climate needs, there's always a sense of, they do polls of people and they say, what can you mainly do to help climate? And they say, you know, not use plastic bags at the refrigerator, or I mean, at the supermarket, or they mention these things that are not, I don't want to say token efforts, everything counts, but they don't always think of the big societal things. And if people better understood the risks of not acting on climate, I think that would help. But there's no substitute for the trade-offs and the companies and the states working together to cite things. Unless we get federal citing, that's really the only path.
Yeah, I see. Francis, what do you think about this?
Well, I think citing is very, very challenging. Always has been, probably will be. But I think Cheryl's point is right. We're in a crisis. It's going to have huge ramifications on the well-being of people. There's a human side to this that really has to be expressed and understood. And going back to Cheryl's example of, you know, the national rail system, the national highway system, there are things that the country needs to do to make it possible to address the long-term climate dangers that are in front of us. And we haven't done the best job communicating what those are and why these investments are necessary and how they have to go forward. I mean, we just have to do a better job at that. But I think that, you know, basically looking at how President Biden is approaching a lot of this, particularly the human side of it, is, you know, a good path for all of us. It's not, yes, we need to base our solutions on science and on technology, but we have to get people on board and to understand. And, you know, one thing that I guess gives me hope is if you look at the Yale Climate Communications data that comes out from Tony Lacerowitz on a regular basis, you know, the American public is moving. It is moving. It's not moving as rapidly as maybe we'd like, but as the extreme weather events, droughts, fires, floods take place across the country, there is growing awareness. And, you know, the toxicity of, or the lack of bipartisanship in Congress, I think does not reflect where the majority of the American public is on this issue. And somehow we have to cross that divide to get broader support to actually move these things forward. And, you know, whether that's going to happen in Congress is one question, but we may be able to do it with a concerted collaborative effort at the state level and with the existing authorities, and take it to the people who are concerned about the consequences on them personally. So I think there is a strategy, and it's not just a policy strategy, it's definitely a communication strategy as well.
I'll take Mary's response on this, the grid issue in a second. I'd just like to follow up a point that you raised there, Francis, which is, do you, talking about bipartisanship, does an organization like yours, do you detect any support for action on the climate front amongst Republicans in Congress or more generally?
I wish I detected more.
Yes, that's true, but do you detect any?
You know, I'm not in the middle of it as I once was. I don't detect a big move towards climate action on the part of the Republicans. I detect a acceptance of the science that maybe we didn't have a few years ago, but I don't see that that's propelling them to action. And, you know, accepting the science and not disputing it is an important step, but it's way long overdue.
Yeah, thanks. Mary, let's get your take on expanding the grid, because it's clearly a crucial issue.
Yes, so I think that the chances of getting congressional Republican support, other than through some very targeted, frankly, district-oriented approaches that bring specific jobs and opportunities into local communities, probably don't stand a great chance of success, given the ideological breakdown that Francis is talking about. But I want to cite the example of California, where we like to say that we had a bipartisan approach because Governor Schwarzenegger was and is a Republican, despite the fact that some members of the party don't necessarily accept him as such. But the fact that there's so little interest on the part of most of the elected Republicans in the sort of traditional mainstream infrastructure, business support is discouraging, because the thing that has changed most, I think, in the last few years has been the shift on the part of leadership in the business community at all levels in the direction of asking for and pushing for climate action. I can hope that that will begin to penetrate, but it's not there yet. However, I would say that the success that we have seen, despite the fact that it hasn't gotten us everywhere we would like to go, but the fact that we were able to implement a cap and trade program in California that raised billions of dollars, which the state has been able to invest in a variety of different community-oriented programs, is the single thing that has brought Republicans to the table, because there is money to be spent. And when there's money being passed out, they want to make sure that it's going to their communities as well. So I think there are additional ways in which we can get people's support, even if we may not have their hearts and minds.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, good point. Thank you. Let me ask you another question, Mary. What can the country as a whole learn from California's experience?
I think there's a couple of things that we should be able to share with our fellow states and with the federal government. Probably the first and most important is that it takes a mix of measures. There is not one single solution to achieving the kind of massive transformation in our energy systems that we're talking about. It's going to take both targeted regulations, strong standards. The kind of goals that everybody is now announcing are a first step in that direction. And it's really important that we now start work on the implementation. But the implementation of those standards is going to have to include a wide variety of different measures, and they may not be the same in every region of the country because of the different mix of resources that we all have. So the idea of having strong goals and a mixed portfolio of measures to get there, to me, is probably the single greatest lesson of what California has been able to accomplish in terms of actually seeing reduced emissions.
Thanks, Cheryl. Francis, do you have any comments on that?
Well, I think Mary really set the standard for how to address climate. I always say that, California is basically on the cutting edge and has shown the rest of us how to go forward. But, I think Mary's point is every state's different. The mix of energy is different. So the goal can be similar, but figuring out the strategy is going to be quite different. And we're seeing that in New York right now, that has bold climate goals, but it's not California. It's going to address them in a different way. And obviously one is going to be major commitment to offshore wind that's hopefully realized. And so, I think there's a ton to learn from California. And we've seen that not only in other states in the US, but in initiatives in other parts of the world who look at California as a model as well. And it's, Mary can actually comment on this. I'd be very interested in her view of, you're learning as you go. So what was really successful, and then what was really hard, and what lessons do you take from that? Because things were changing over time. You were adding on things. Some things worked, some things didn't. And I think that's even more instructive than what the final picture is, because it's the road that California has gone down that's going to really show us what to look out for in other parts of the country and other parts of the world. So maybe Mary could comment on that.
If you don't mind, Jeff, I'll
Please,
I'll
please, yes,
jump in and
absolutely.
respond directly. Sure. So I think Francis is citing something that probably is the fundamental secret, if there is a secret, to what California has been able to do in the area of air pollution and climate policy. And that is that we were willing to set very ambitious goals that we didn't quite know how we were going to meet, although we had strong confidence that technology existed that could get us there, and then a willingness to tinker as you move along. So firmness about the goals and about the need to move forward, but flexibility about making changes if something isn't working, or if it turns out to be working much better than you think. Example being a measure that we call the low carbon fuel standard, which hasn't gotten quite as much attention as some of our other programs, but actually may be the most innovative of all the things that California has done, because we simply said anybody who sells transportation fuel in California is going to have to reduce the amount of carbon in their overall sales by 10%. Just do it. And then we set up a system where businesses that could sell credits into the system, into a private market, through registering and developing very low carbon fuels. Now, this program has turned out to be a complete boon to the people who make renewable biodiesel. It's been huge for them. It turns out it's also not been so bad for even the Midwest corn ethanol producers, because they were able to produce ethanol with much less carbon by shifting away from coal into cleaner forms of energy for producing the ethanol. And there was a market for the ethanol because the oil refiners wanted to use it in gasoline. It's an octane booster. So we created this program at the time thinking we were going to have multinational companies developing exciting new forms of diesel or gasoline. What we ended up with was incentives for people to build hydrogen fueling stations, electric charging stations that were open to the public, and new forms of fuels as well. But there were a lot of smaller companies that cropped up to make these new products, and they were given meaningful incentives to do it, because the cost of credits under this program that the major fuel suppliers needed is over $100 per unit of carbon. So we're talking about a policy which was developed by academics. It was adopted by the board, which had the power to do it because the legislature had allowed us to create a program without having to actually spell out the details. And then a willingness as the program developed and evolved to make it more appropriate for what we were actually seeing in the marketplace. And I think that's a kind of example that I would urge others to take a look at. But it does involve a level of willingness on the part of the elected officials to allow an expert agency to have some running room, to give them the backing that they needed to do the work. And a willingness on the part of the private sector to come in and say, okay, we're going to give this a shot. And, some people have made a lot of money as a result of this, others not so much. There are some fuels that thought they were going to be a big success that didn't quite work out that way. But that's the nature of progress in this area.
Cheryl.
I would point to a few things that I think California has done really well and can be a model. They were a model at monetizing the carbon improvement that they needed and setting goals, which I believe has worked for so many other things we're trying to reduce and other pollutants and all. They took an all sector approach very early in looking not just at the electric grid, but at transportation and so forth. That I think is critical to what they've achieved. And they were willing to spend money and build things to get the job done. The Tehachapi power line that went from California across to deliver renewables is looked at as one of the big national successes. There was another one, and I can't for the life of me remember the name, that was going on in Southern California while I was at FERC, where ran into all kinds of problems. They had to spend a tremendous amount of money to bury it under one community, but they finally figured it out and they did bury it and they built the line. And it's not on the litany of failed projects that I talked about earlier in my remarks. I do think I've talked about about Mary on other occasions. I go to a lot of meetings where other states say, oh, we don't want to be like California. There's someone called a Caliphobia, afraid of the California's policies or whatever. But I think that's abating. And we saw when there were the limited rolling blackouts last August in California, you saw the national press jumping on, oh, that's because of all their climate action and so forth. And then when we saw the blackouts that were unfortunately, much more extensive and tragic in Texas, you see, well, you know what? Climate adaptation and changing weather is not just a California issue, it's an issue everywhere. So maybe there are some things we can learn. I think there's also things, I'll just say one more thing, we can learn from the way California is handling the wildfires. Some of what they're doing to redesign the distribution grids to make it easier to turn people on and off and not affect critical customers is a national model, but they're spending money. None of this is free, and California is willing to spend the money to do what it wants to do.
Let me ask you a question which has come up in the Q&A section. I think you've already addressed it in writing, actually, Cheryl, but I think it's a big enough issue that we should all talk about it, which is the role of nuclear power in a clean economy going forward. Obviously, slightly controversial issue. And there's two issues really here. One is, should we keep existing nuclear power stations going? I mean, here in New York, for example, the governor has just closed down the Indian Point power station, although he's kept one of the upstate power stations running. And should we build new nuclear power stations? What's your take on it? Cheryl, you addressed this in the chat, so why don't you lead off on this?
Well, the specific question in the chat was why, when I mentioned resources to balance renewables, natural gas and storage and so forth, I didn't mention nuclear. And the reason was, I think of nuclear as being more of a base load that you turn it on and it stays on. There are some newer technologies you can ramp up and down, not always as quickly as you need to follow the wind. It's not generally seen as a fast acting, but there are newer types of nuclear that can ramp. But that's an answer to the narrow question. Nuclear technology works, and both the existing baseload units are, I believe, our biggest, right up with hydro, in the biggest source of new carbon-free energy in the United States today. And the newer modular models that are coming in, I believe, will also work. They're being used in France and elsewhere. The issues to building new units are entirely political. The lack of a waste solution in the United States is a significant issue for some people. And there's just been so many problems with overruns and political opposition that not many people have the balance sheet to say we're going to take on building a new nuclear unit. But the technology definitely works. In terms of retaining the old units, I think if you had any kind of a carbon pricing solution that measured in any way that was commensurate with a level of carbon improvement we want, that would be one of the first solutions that was grabbed, along with more energy efficiency. Most of the modeling I've seen, the first thing you get is a lot more efficiency, and then retaining clean things is the second cheapest thing before you get to building new clean things. We can't retain ones that aren't safe. We obviously, the NRC is figuring out how long these things can last, but retaining ones that can be safely operated, I think, would be a result of carbon pricing, because it's building new one. There is one going up in Georgia, but it's more of I'm quite confident that the Southern Company will finish it and it will operate for a long time, but it's been so expensive and delayed and fraught with issues that I think it's going to be another cautionary tale for the people who don't need much of a push not to build nuclear.
Right. And Francis, what's your take on this?
So it's similar to Cheryl's. I think that new nuclear plants, full-size new nuclear plants as we've built in the past, they're unbelievably expensive. They don't compete with other sources of clean power. And the waste problem is not solved, and there is not a tremendous amount of public support for it. So I don't see that as a path going forward. I was on a committee at DOE on small modular reactors. People are optimistic that maybe they'll work, and they could be placed actually at existing sites that had already gone through permitting, perhaps, so they wouldn't have the same siting problem. But I think they still have the same obstacle to public support. As far as existing plants continuing, I'm of the mind, and I'm not speaking for NRDC here, I'll just say that, but I think that if operated safely and the less safe plants are coming offline, we have to transition to a clean energy future, and we need to get there. And I think if we could keep existing plants going that are operating safely as we make that transition, we'll probably, that would be probably the best strategy going forward. It's not a particularly popular strategy with the environmental community, but I think it's actually the practical strategy to reaching net zero that by mid-century. If we took all those plants offline, it's a very heavy barrier to getting to where we need to go, I think.
Right. Yeah, Mary, you want to add into this?
I don't think I have a lot to add here. We had at one time, 2 large baseload nuclear power plants in California. One of them, the San Onofre plant has been offline for years due to safety issues that arose after it had been in operation for some period of time. And it's a long, slow process to clean that up. And there's nowhere else to take the contaminated waste to. The other, the Diablo Canyon plant, which was built in an area that many people thought was unsuitable for a nuclear plant because of earthquake safety issues, has been operating, but the owner chose not to try to get it relicensed when its license expired. I think for all the reasons that everyone has cited, the economics, the concerns about future viability, just made it look less attractive than many other options that the company wanted to invest in. But they negotiated a very careful plan with their employee unions and with the communities to try to make the gradual decommissioning of the plant something that would be less disruptive, more acceptable overall. And now people are again asking the question, gee, maybe we really shouldn't let it happen because we're going to need that electricity and other options may not be as affordable or as present for baseload power. I think they're going to proceed with the plan anyway, but it's just, and I think we'll be fine, but it's these decisions get re-examined all the time.
Yeah, thank you. It is a complicated issue, isn't it? Yeah. There's another couple of questions in the chat about negative emissions, carbon capture and storage, direct air capture, and so on. Francis, do you see those playing a significant role in the next couple of decades? I'll ask it to all of you, but Francis, you want to kick us off on that? Well,
I've been following this issue for, I'd say, a decade anyway, and I know, you read the 2018 IPCC report, you look at all these reports, and it's, we can't get there without CCS, but meanwhile, CCS is not commercialized yet, and it's not going to be probably, even with stimulus help, until there's a price on carbon. So it's sort of the chicken and the egg. When does it happen? Does it happen? I know very strong opinions on both sides of, we could get there without it and we can't get there without it. And so I'm not an expert. I imagine that the technology will develop. I think it's, it's going to depend on the regulatory side of the issue about how quickly natural gas begins to be contained and how much investment is going to go into keeping natural gas alive if it's only going to be alive with CCS. So, I don't know how it's going to transpire, but I think it is quite a complicated issue, and we will see how it develops.
Cheryl, you want to add something?
Well, I think it's a really promising technological solution. Mary's and my colleague Dr. Julio Friedman at Columbia is one of the world experts on this. I agree with Francis. It doesn't seem ready for large scale commercial use yet. I guess my feeling about this is there's so much we can do, but we haven't done with the technologies right in front of us. I go to so many meetings where the talk is like, well, we can get 75% of the way with wind and solar. What are we going to do? How are we going to do the other 25%? Let's keep researching that. But in the meantime, what do we have to go from 17% to 75% with the technologies we have? So there's tons to work on while the smart people figure out that last bit. I mean, if we maximize the wind and solar and balanced it with natural gas, we take a lot of carbon out of the electric grid. And then by the time we do all that, maybe we'll have these wonderful solutions ready for us.
Yeah, good point. Okay, Mary.
So I'm a believer in not wasting anything that you already have. I think that's the first principle of environmentalism. So I am not one of those people who wants to tear out existing pipelines or leave them to molder in the ground. I think we need to find ways to adapt the systems that we already have to our current needs. But at the same time, knowing that we've got to get to a world of zero combustion, basically nothing being burned, it makes a big difference in my thinking about how much we want to invest in patching and fixing, the existing systems where there's an opportunity to shift funds into new and much more promising technology. So I guess I want to see a faster change. And again, as others have said, putting a price on carbon is the way to get there. It's just, it's so obvious. And so doesn't mean that it can be implemented easily. There are many ways of doing it. I saw some questions when I looked at the Q&A before about cap and dividend versus tax and dividend, tax and cap. Whatever. I am quite agnostic about all of that. I can poke holes in almost any system you propose. I could also, find arguments in favor of it. But let's do something that shows that it's worth people's money and effort to make the shift. And I can't think of any other way in an economy like ours to do that.
Indeed.
I just add to Jeff that we were talking right before we got on about how the fact is when you set a standard that has to be met, we've seen a host of examples where innovation happens very quickly despite all the protests. And I think this is and actually we've moved in the renewable arena a lot faster than the projections were. The prices come down much more precipitously than anyone thought, and we move much faster than anyone thought. So, to Mary's point, setting the signal so that commitment to innovation and investment occurs, and you can see the path that you're going to go down, and give the private sector the latitude to begin to go down that path is really important. And we've just not been able to get to the point of sending the signal, which I think is really, and despite that, I mean, the best signal we sent were tax incentives for solar and wind, which made a huge difference. And yet we argue about it every few years about whether to continue them. And, it's sort of, if this is an urgent issue of now, which we believe it is, we should be prepared to set those signals so that we can unleash innovation and get us down that path as quickly as possible.
Thank you. Yeah. Let me ask you one last question, because we've only got 4 minutes left now. There's 3 big blocks of emissions in the US. One is obviously power generation, and we've been talking primarily so far about how to clean up power generation. Second, of course, is transportation. The third actually is buildings, heating space in buildings, heating water in buildings and so on. Here in New York City, for example, the biggest source of emissions by far is actually emissions from buildings. It's something that we really haven't tackled at all very much at the policy level. And New York has local law 97, but there's nothing at the federal level really other than tighter building standards. What should we be doing about reducing emissions from buildings?
Well, I'm going to leave the specifics to Mary, but you know, efficiency has just been shown time and again as being the fastest, cheapest way to get there. And yet, in some ways, it's the least exciting. So it's not the one that gets the public attention and public support. But we do need to put in all the features that we can to make buildings as efficient as possible and electrify them. So that does include building codes and includes standards on appliances and equipment and the machinery that's in buildings. And it does get to how the grid is actually, you know, what kind of electricity is being generated. And, you know, it's sort of the combination of those factors. And it's, you know, NRDC has worked on efficiency since the 70s, and it never gets the attention that it should. Mary, I'm curious about.
No, that's true. I completely agree with you. I think I would just add that you sort of divide the world between new and existing when it comes to buildings. And in the case of new buildings, we need a much more holistic approach to decarbonizing the entire construction and life of buildings that we're creating. So, you know, new hookups are for gas are certainly one big issue, and appliances, as Francis said, efficiency of the buildings themselves, but also efficiency of the materials that are used and the way the buildings are used and how people get to those buildings are all facts that need to be put into the mix when it comes to envisioning future communities. But I think when it comes to the existing stock of buildings, I've seen some research that suggests that, you know, not every building is a historic building. Not every unit that was ever created is worth spending the money to retrofit as opposed to replace. And that's something that, again, it's hard to imagine, but in a context where you're doing other big things and rethinking what mega cities are going to look like in the future, we have to be looking at what the building stock it could be. There's a natural life cycle to cities that we know sometimes in California has been seen as, you know, ignoring the past and not treating all historical buildings with the respect that they deserve. And it's a fair criticism, but there's also a lot of stuff that was built cheaply, inefficiently, and could afford to be, the land that's under it could afford to be looked at in a new light.
Interesting. Right.
I also think on that, you know, this is a crucial issue, particularly in China and India, where the bill, you know, that by 2050, I don't know, I can't remember the percentage, a huge portion of the buildings will be brand new. So how those buildings are built at the standards to which they're built to is going to have a huge impact on what the energy demand in those countries is as they ramp up economically. So there, you know, there's looking at efficiency and cooling, for example, in particularly in the global South, is just a critical issue towards the global carbon budget.
We're actually unfortunately out of time at this point, so I've got to wrap up. But we could clearly go on for another hour on this topic. I mean, I've had a long list of questions here, a long list of questions in the chat, and we got through a very small fraction of them. But anyway, thank you very much. Let me thank Mary Nichols, Francis Barnicki, and Cheryl Lafleur very much indeed for their willingness to take part in this and for their fascinating insights. Thank the viewers for being online and watching this. I remind you that this will be available online in a couple of days' time, and that this is part of the Center on Global Energy Policy's annual Energy Summit. And with that, I bring things to a close. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank
Pleasure to be here.
Thank you.